Welcome back to Fantasy Jeopardy! I am your host, Daniel, and today we have just one last question for our contestants. Well, Daniel382, I've heard you've existed for a whole 5 seconds now. How do you feel about existence?
Thanks, Daniel. It's very painful.
Wonderful. Now let's go to the board here. For this final question, we have the category of epic fantasy. This epic fantasy series has themes revolving around the cyclical nature of destiny and storytelling, mankind versus nature, mankind versus magic, and an intense focus on human bodily functions such as urination and ejaculation. Contestants?
Oh! What is the Dark Tower?
That is correct! Congratulations! You have won this round of Epic Jeopardy Fantasy. Wait, does that mean our reality ceases to exist? Oh no, we're going. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. What you have just heard is the opening lines to what many consider to be one of the most controversial fantasy epics ever written. These books are also responsible for me shifting the title of this video series from Why You Should Read to Before You Read, because I do not want to imply from the title alone that this book series is for everyone. The Dark Tower, in fact, in my opinion, while it is outstanding, is rather hard to recommend, especially to fantasy fans who are not Stephen King fans. This is partially due to how closely it is often tied to many of Stephen King's other books, to the point where characters from other Stephen King works will even reappear, but I think every epic fantasy fan should at least consider reading it. In this video, I'm going to explain why I am being so cautious before recommending starting The Dark Tower. In the Dark Tower series, we follow the last of the Gunslingers, an organization whose sole duty is to protect the All-World, a parallel to our own, which is on the brink of moving on, a commonly used expression for the collapse of not only civilization, but reality itself. This lone gunslinger, Roland, pursues the man in black for reasons even he is unsure of. Now, I don't want to say too much more about the actual story of the Dark Tower, due to me believing that one of the biggest selling points of this series is just how unpredictable and insane the narrative can be. But what I will say is there are familiar fantasy elements at play, of course. Roland, our protagonist, is an enhanced individual. His gunslinger training is immense, and he has abilities far beyond that of your average person with a pistol. His companions, Eddie and Susan, I will let you get to know on your own if you decide to pick up the Dark Tower, but they are definitely alternative typical fantasy companions, and developed and understood in a way only Stephen King can handle character. Of course, there is a magic system that I believe does reflect much more to the older, softer magic systems we are familiar with in the fantasy genre. If you are familiar with the Stephen King multiverse, you already know of Ka and its guiding influence over reality. But do not expect this magic system to be frequently wielded throughout the series in a way you might expect if your greatest exposure to fantasy is something along the lines of Mistborn. I would rank the magic system on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being never used within the actual text, simply being lore elements, and 10 out of 10 being in every single conversation and involved in every single physical form of combat, at a 4 or 5 out of 10. If you're a heavy magic reader, this may not be an element of the series you enjoy. When it comes to reading Dark Tower, theme and character are heralded above all else. Examining the metatext and understanding why Stephen King takes the narrative in the direction he does is crucial to not only enjoying the Dark Tower as a whole, but to the very ending of the series itself. One thing I can promise you though, if you push deep enough into the text as a reader, is a love for the Ka-Tet, or the companion fellowship at the center of this story. But let's go ahead and transition into why you should or should not read The Dark Tower, based off its criticisms and praises. Well, the first thing I want to get out of the way is a simple recommendation of reading at least one other Stephen King book before picking up The Dark Tower, if you have not already, just to make sure you vibe with his writing style. This is important to do because Stephen King is notoriously a polarizing writer. I have an entire video on pitching various Stephen King works based on your own personal taste that I will link down below and have a card on the screen for now. Now, the parallels to Lord of the Rings itself within the Dark Tower are abundant, but beyond that, I wouldn't expect many Tolkienisms within this series. Instead, brace yourself for maybe the grandest display of Stephen Kingisms that he has ever put into any works. Basically, if you have heard a stereotype of Stephen King's writing, I can promise you it exists throughout this story. Don't believe me? Well, not important to the actual plot or narrative, spoiler warning, there is Dr. Doom werewolf murderbots in this fantasy world. I'm not kidding, and it completely makes sense that they exist within the narrative. A crippled pregnant woman also is possessed by a demon, and your main protagonist, Gunslinger, is without question a sociopath. Due to these elements, this is not your typical good versus bad guy story, and that's where Stephen King really rallies against a lot of the ideas Tolkien put forward, where he did have a very light and dark element to his narrative. Stephen King puts the evils of humanity to the forefront, and the question of deserving salvation. There is also an extremely controversial theme in the repetitive nature of destiny, and this theme is dissected to excruciating effect. I can't get into that too deep without spoilers, but it does lend greatly to the controversial ending of the Dark Tower. People cannot agree whether or not it is pure genius based on its devotion to realizing themes, or if it's a gigantic narrative middle finger to everyone who pushed through all the way to the end. Personally, I think both have points. This is a ending to a book. I'm fairly confident, based off my previous comments on Stephen King videos where I talk about his writing style and narrative flair, half the people are thinking this sounds incredible, and the other half are very turned off by the idea of Stephen King exploring these ideas in his very brutal fashion. And this idea actually continues throughout the Dark Tower fanbase. Even the most die-hard fans have trouble agreeing on every single pro and con of this whole story. But let's get into the hottest points of contention. The first book, The Gunslinger, just as a warning, is weak compared to the rest of the series. It does get better for there, my personal favorite being Wolves of the Kala, but yes, the Dark Tower does start a bit slow, and the pacing is not perfect throughout. In fact, I would say that is the weakest in general element to the Dark Tower. Its pacing suffers heavily. One more negative I do want to hit on is the reaching of catharsis through narrative is not something Stephen King seemed to care about, especially when it came to final confrontations of a certain kind. And this is a real 1, 2, 3 punch that results in the ending that I have mentioned being so different. But with those negatives being said, let's transition into the absolute positives of the Dark Tower. Without question, it's going to be different than any fantasy story you have recently read. There is nothing else out there like it. If you are someone who feels like they need a palate cleanser after reading a lot of fantasy but doesn't necessarily want to venture outside the genre, this can be something different that will certainly still be fantasy while giving you an entirely new taste. Using this philosophy, Stephen King takes every typical character trope within fantasy and attempts to flip it on its head, and as a result, then take the narrative in directions that fantasy fans, at least in my experience, just aren't used to. And finally, this is not heroic fantasy. We have characters within our quartet who commit horrific acts, unforgivable acts, and the story around them is not whether or not they are good or can be redeemed, it's one of conscience. Now, one thing that is very popular in fantasy is a morally gray protagonist as well as the whole party, and again, I think this is where Stephen King shines. This might be along more what you'd expect for fantasy now, but again, I think it's handled in such a Stephen King fashion, it's going to be well outside of what is typical. But when it comes to this fellowship itself, your hero is not heroic, and your sidekicks are not supportive yes-men. There is conflict within the group that goes beyond simple misunderstandings, and the overall objective becomes a point of contention among this party. In fact, that is one of my favorite conflicts the Dark Tower brings to the table, due to our gunslinger's zealous pursuit of the man in black being something he can never stray from. So that is the best spoiler-free pitch for the Dark Tower I can manage. But you, a fantasy fan, must ask yourself, do you want to join the hunt for the man in black.